I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event, and I need to say that.
King Charles just made the most consequential decision of his entire reign. And the people who understand how the British monarchy actually works are absolutely stunned, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it reveals about everything happening behind closed palace doors right now. We are talking about a move so deliberate, so calculated, and so historically loaded that it has reshuffled the entire power structure of the Windsor dynasty in one stroke. Princess Anne, the woman the press largely ignored for decades, the royal who never chased a headline, the Princess Royal who kept her head down and did the work while others grabbed the spotlight, has just been handed the keys to the kingdom, literally. And the fallout is only just beginning. Before we get into what this really means, let me ask you something. When you think about real power inside the British royal family, who comes to mind? William? Camilla? Maybe Charles himself? The answer, as of right now, should be none of them. Because the person holding actual constitutional authority, the person with access to classified state documents, intelligence briefings, and the mechanisms that keep this country running, is Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise, Princess Royal, Counsellor of State, and now, the most powerful non-monarch in British royal history. Stay with me here, because this story goes so much deeper than the headlines. The red box nobody is talking about. Let's start with the thing that triggered all of this, the red box. If you've never heard of the sovereign's red box, here's what you need to understand. This is not a prop. This is not decoration. The red box is the physical container that holds everything that matters in British governance. Classified intelligence reports, draft legislation, state correspondence, briefing papers from cabinet ministers. Every single day, the reigning monarch opens that box and engages with the real machinery of running the United Kingdom. It is the most direct, tangible symbol of royal constitutional authority that exists. And here's the thing that should make you sit up straight. That box just landed in Princess Anne's hands instead of Camilla's. Think about what that means. Camilla is queen consort. She wears the crown. She sits beside Charles at every state occasion. She is, by every ceremonial definition, the second most prominent figure in the royal household. And yet, when it came time to decide who actually gets to see what's inside that box, who gets to engage with the real business of the monarchy when Charles cannot, the king chose his sister. Not his wife, his sister. This was not an oversight. There are no oversights in the British royal family. Every decision, every appointment, every ceremonial gesture is deliberate and loaded with meaning. So when Charles made this call, he was saying something specific and unmistakable to everyone paying attention. He was saying, "I trust Anne with power. I do not trust Camilla with power." That is an extraordinary statement. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why? The crisis nobody will admit out loud. To understand why Charles made this move, you have to understand the pressure the monarchy is actually operating under right now. Charles is dealing with serious health issues. That is public knowledge. He has been open about his treatment, far more open than any previous monarch would have dreamed of being. And the British public has responded with surprising sympathy. But openness about health struggles does not solve the practical problem those struggles create. You cannot have a monarch attending medical treatments and simultaneously managing the daily demands of constitutional governance. Something has to give. So the question becomes, who fills the gap? The obvious answer, the answer that the line of succession would suggest, is Prince William. He is the heir. He is the future. Logically, William should be the one absorbing administrative responsibilities while his father focuses on recovery. That is what the textbook version of the Windsor succession would dictate. But here is what the textbook does not account for: real life. William is not in a position to carry that weight right now, and anyone who looks at his actual situation clearly understands why. Catherine has been going through her own deeply serious health recovery. William has 3 young children who need a present and engaged father. He is already shouldering an enormous psychological burden, the weight of knowing that the crown will one day be his, that every decision he makes now is preparation for a role he will carry for the rest of his life. To layer on top of all of that the full administrative demands of a monarch unable to govern would not just stretch William thin, it could genuinely break him. And Charles knows that. More importantly, Charles respects that. He is not going to sacrifice his son's stability and his grandchildren's relationship with their father on the altar of royal protocol. So he looked elsewhere. He looked at the one person in the entire family who has the experience, the credibility, the institutional knowledge, and, crucially, the lack of personal ambition that makes real power safe to hand over. He looked at Anne. Why Anne is the only person who could do this? Here is where this story gets genuinely fascinating, because Anne's qualifications for this role are not accidental. They were built across decades, through a combination of deliberate preparation by Queen Elizabeth and Anne's own extraordinary work ethic and character. Start with the basics. Anne is only 2 years younger than Charles. That is not just a number. That means she was present, actively, consciously present, during the same political eras, the same historical turning points, the same crises and transformations that shaped Charles's entire worldview. She does not need to be briefed on why certain constitutional precedents matter. She was there when they were established. That kind of institutional memory is irreplaceable, and in a moment of genuine governance crisis, it is worth more than any number of formal qualifications. But here is the factor that most people simply do not consider, and it is arguably the most important one. Anne has absolutely zero dynastic ambition. Now, you might be asking yourself, is that actually a good thing? Should the person holding state power not be driven and ambitious? In normal politics, sure. But in royal politics, having no ambition is everything. Because the danger in giving power to someone close to the throne is always the same danger, that they will use that power to advance themselves, to build their own faction, to position themselves or their allies for greater influence. That is how dynasties tear themselves apart from the inside. Anne is immune to that entire dynamic. Under the old rules of male preference primogeniture, the succession system that existed when she and Charles were growing up, Anne was actually born second, but eventually found herself pushed further and further down the line as brothers arrived. She got bumped. She got sidelined by the rules of a system that prioritized gender over birth order. And here is the remarkable thing. She simply accepted it. She did not fight it, did not resent it publicly, did not spend decades nursing a grievance about her place in the family hierarchy. What she did instead was work. She turned away from the question of position and turned entirely toward the question of purpose. And that decision, made quietly, without fanfare, without anyone really noticing at the time, is exactly what makes her the right person to hold power now. When Anne walks into a room with that red box, or delivers a communication from the king to the prime minister, nobody in that room suspects she is doing it for herself. There is no faction behind her. There is no rival bloc using her as a vehicle to undermine Charles. She is the messenger, and everyone knows it. She cannot become monarch even if she tried. There is no incentive for her to manipulate anything. And in a world of royal politics where every gesture is scrutinized for hidden motive, that kind of transparent integrity is absolutely invaluable. Elizabeth's master plan, the groundwork laid decades ago. What most people completely miss when they look at Anne's rise is that this is not a sudden development. This is the culmination of something Queen Elizabeth began engineering more than half a century ago. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, whenever the British Commonwealth faced a genuine crisis, not a ceremonial inconvenience, but a real moment of political tension and fragile diplomacy, Elizabeth sent Anne. Not to wave at crowds, not to open hospitals and pose for photographs. Anne was dispatched to the places where things were genuinely difficult. The tense negotiations, the Commonwealth relationships that needed careful, skilled handling, the situations where a wrong word or a misread gesture could cause real damage. Elizabeth was giving her daughter an education that you simply cannot get in a classroom or a briefing room. She was training Anne in the actual craft of statecraft at the highest level, sending her in with real autonomy and real authority to make decisions on behalf of the Crown when the Queen herself could not be present. Decade after decade, assignment after assignment, Anne was quietly being shaped into exactly the kind of person the monarchy would need when things got complicated. And then, right at the end of her own life, Elizabeth made the move that locked all of it into place. In late 2022, as the Queen was entering the final weeks of her life and thinking clearly about what Charles's reign would require, she orchestrated an amendment to the Regency Acts through Parliament. She added both Princess Anne and Prince Edward to the permanent list of Counsellors of State. Not temporarily, not conditionally, permanently, for their lifetimes. Now, let's be clear about why this was such a strategically brilliant move. The old list of people technically eligible to step in and exercise the monarch's powers in an emergency had a serious problem. It was compromised. Prince Harry had removed himself from royal duties entirely.
Forget everything you think you know about the headline that's been flooding your feed this week. King Charles did not sign a midnight decree. There was no secret ceremony under cover of darkness at Buckingham Palace. There is no title in British history called Princess Royal Regent, and no royal order making princess and a regent has ever been issued. That story, the one with the rain-soaked palace courtyard and the crimson-sealed document carried through empty corridors after midnight, is fiction. It has spread across dozens of channels and articles in the last few weeks, recycled and rewritten so many times that it now sounds like established fact. It isn't, but here's what should genuinely stop you in your tracks. The real story, the one buried underneath that viral fabrication, is more consequential than the myth built on top of it. Because Princess Anne really has become one of the most powerful non-reigning figures in the modern British monarchy. It just didn't happen at midnight. It happened slowly, deliberately, and in full public view, if you knew where to look. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back to November of 2022, just weeks before Queen Elizabeth II's death. On his birthday, the 14th of that month, King Charles wrote formally to the House of Lords requesting a change to the law governing who could act on the monarch's behalf. The mechanism he was invoking is called the Counsellors of State system, and it has existed since the Regency Act of 1937. Under that law, when a monarch is unwell or out of the country, a small group of senior royals can be legally authorized to carry out most of the sovereign's official duties, signing routine documents, receiving credentials from foreign ambassadors, attending to the ordinary business of state that cannot simply pause. Traditionally, that group has consisted of the monarch's spouse and the next 4 adults in the line of succession over the age of 21. For Charles, that meant Camilla, Prince William, Prince Harry, Prince Andrew, and Princess Beatrice. And that is where the problem became obvious. 2 of those 4 names, Harry and Andrew, were no longer working members of the royal family. Harry had stepped back from official duties and relocated to the United States. Andrew had withdrawn from public life following the fallout of his association with Jeffrey Epstein. Princess Beatrice, while remaining on paper as eligible, had never functioned as a working royal either. In practical terms, the people legally permitted to act for the king in an emergency were, for the most part, people the palace could not realistically call upon. That is not speculation or palace gossip. It was stated plainly in Parliament by Lord True, the leader of the House of Lords, who confirmed that only working members of the royal family would actually be asked to serve, even though the others technically remained on the list. So Charles asked Parliament to widen the pool. He requested that his sister, Princess, and his younger brother, Prince Edward, be added as additional Counsellors of State, not replacing anyone, but standing alongside them, so that the Crown would always have enough active, trusted, working royals available to step in. The bill moved through Parliament with striking speed. It received royal assent on the 6th of December, just 22 days after the King's initial request. It is now formally known as the Counsellors of State Act 2022, and it is public legislation, viewable in full through the UK government's own legislation archive. There was no secrecy involved. There was no midnight signing. It happened through the ordinary, transparent machinery of British lawmaking, covered at the time by the BBC and reported in Parliament itself. This is the real foundation of everything people are now calling, inaccurately, a regency. Princess, and did not receive a new title. She received something arguably more significant. Formal legal authority, written into statute, to act on behalf of the Crown whenever she is needed. And unlike a ceremonial honor, this authority does not expire, does not require renewal, and cannot be quietly withdrawn. It exists for her lifetime. Now, why not lean more heavily on William, the heir, the person who will one day inherit all of this permanently? The honest answer lies in timing and circumstance rather than intrigue. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles had been diagnosed with a form of cancer, discovered incidentally during treatment for a separate, benign prostate condition. The palace never disclosed the specific type or stage, respecting the king's privacy, but it confirmed that he would step back from public-facing engagements while continuing with state paperwork, the so-called red boxes, behind the scenes. He returned to public duties within a couple of months, in April of that year, but the treatment continued for nearly 2 years. In March of 2025, he was briefly hospitalized after experiencing side effects. It was not until this past December, in a personal video message recorded for Channel 4's Stand Up to Cancer campaign, that Charles was able to share genuinely good news. Thanks to early diagnosis and consistent treatment, his schedule of care could finally be reduced heading into 2026. He described it, in his own words, as both a personal blessing and a testament to advances in cancer treatment. At almost exactly the same time, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was diagnosed with cancer of her own, announced roughly a month after her father-in-law's diagnosis became public. She underwent a course of preventative chemotherapy through much of 2024 before announcing in January of 2025 that she was in remission. William, then, was not managing some vague or exaggerated burden during this period. He was supporting his wife through a serious health crisis while raising 3 young children, all while continuing his own public duties and preparing, as heir, for a role he will carry for the rest of his life. Asking him to simultaneously absorb the full administrative weight of a monarch who could not always be present would have been, by any reasonable measure, an enormous amount to place on one person during an already difficult chapter, and, by contrast, was available, experienced, and already deeply embedded in the machinery of royal duty. She has spent decades as one of the hardest-working members of the family, consistently ranking at or near the top of the annual list of royal engagements, a tally kept by royal commentators and widely reported each year based on the official court circular. In 2025, she completed 478 official engagements, a 10% increase over the previous year, trailing only her brother the king, who completed 532. That is not a ceremonial figure. That is the record of someone who has spent her adult life doing the unglamorous, repetitive, essential work of representing the crown year after year, with almost no interruption. There is also a quieter, more personal thread running underneath all of this, one that becomes clear once you look at how Anne's path through the royal family actually unfolded. She was born in 1950, less than 2 years after Charles, which meant she grew up alongside him through the same defining decades, present for the same institutional history, the same constitutional evolutions, the same slow transformation of the monarchy from an imperial power into a modern ceremonial institution. Under the rules of the time, male preference primogeniture, which governed succession until it was formally abolished by the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013 and was steadily pushed down the line as her younger brothers were born, despite being the second child of the Queen. She did not fight that publicly. She turned, instead, toward service, building a reputation over more than 50 years as a royal who showed up for the difficult, unglamorous work rather than the photographed appearances. In 1987, Queen Elizabeth granted her the title of Princess Royal, an ancient designation that can be held by only one woman at a time, traditionally given to the eldest daughter of the reigning monarch, and understood within the institution as a signal of lifelong dedication to duty. It was, in its own quiet way, an early recognition of exactly the qualities that would eventually make her indispensable decades later. That trust became visible to the entire world on the 6th of May 2023, the day of King Charles's coronation. Charles personally asked his sister to serve as gold stick in waiting, a ceremonial military role dating back to the reign of Henry VIII, traditionally reserved for the individual entrusted most closely with the sovereign's personal safety. As Colonel of the Blues and Royals in the Household Cavalry, and rode on horseback directly behind the King's gold state coach as it processed from Westminster Abbey back to Buckingham Palace, leading roughly 6,000 armed service members through the streets of London, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. In an interview with CBC ahead of the ceremony, and noted dryly that taking on the role also, in her words, solved her dress problem. It was a small, characteristically understated joke about an assignment that carried enormous symbolic weight. Buckingham Palace sources described it at the time as the king rewarding his sister for what they called her loyalty and unwavering devotion to duty, and called her, in their words, a trusted lieutenant. Her husband's story runs in a quieter parallel track. Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Laurence met, and in 1986, while serving as an equerry to Queen Elizabeth II, a young naval officer working behind the scenes of the royal household. He married, and in 1992, and over more than 3 decades has remained almost entirely out of the public eye, supporting her demanding schedule, without ever seeking recognition of his own. Queen Elizabeth invested him as a member of the Royal Victorian Order in 1989, and later as a Knight Commander in 2011. Then on the 21st of August 2025, in a quiet private ceremony at Balmoral Castle, King Charles elevated him further still to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, the highest rank the order offers. It is worth understanding what that honor actually represents. Unlike most British honors, the Royal Victorian Order is not awarded on the advice of government ministers. It is given entirely at the personal discretion of the reigning monarch, a direct expression of gratitude from the sovereign rather than the state. Sir Timothy became only the second member of the royal family to receive that specific honor since the late Queen gave it to the Princess of Wales in 2019. There was no announcement, no press conference, simply a quiet notation in the court circular, the official published record of royal engagements. That in itself tells you something about how this family communicates its most meaningful gestures, not through spectacle, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate signals over time. Taken together, these are not the scattered details of an unrelated collection of royal stories. They form a single, coherent pattern that has been unfolding gradually since 2022, accelerated by circumstances nobody would have chosen, Charles's illness, Catherine's illness, but shaped by decisions that were made deliberately and openly. Parliament passed legislation. The palace issued honors through its normal channels. Interviews were given to accredited broadcasters. None of it required a secret decree, because none of it needed to hide. The truth of Anne's rising importance within the institution was never actually concealed. It was simply less dramatic, and therefore less viral, than the invented version. And perhaps that is the most important thing to sit with here. In an era where a fabricated headline about a midnight royal decree can spread across the internet faster than a matter of actual parliamentary record, the real story, the one grounded in legislation, in court circular entries, in verifiable interviews, tends to get lost. But the real story is, in its own way, more moving than the myth. It is the story of a woman who was pushed down the line of succession by an accident of birth order, and gender under rules that no longer even exist, who chose not to spend her life resenting that, but to spend it working instead. It is the story of a brother facing his own mortality more publicly than any monarch in modern British history, choosing to lean not on ceremony or performance, but on the sister who had spent 5 decades quietly proving she could be trusted with exactly this kind of responsibility. It is the story of a husband who supported all of it without ever asking for recognition, and who eventually received it anyway, in the quietest possible way a king knows how to give it. There is no fairy tale ending here, no secret coronation, no crown changing hands in the dead of night. What there is instead is something arguably rarer in royal history. A slow, transparent, legally documented transfer of trust, built one parliamentary act, one honor, one ceremonial role at a time, by people who did not need theatrics to make their intentions clear. Princess, and holds no regency, she wears no crown of her own, but within the quiet architecture of a monarchy adapting to illness, uncertainty, and the simple passage of time, she has become something the palace itself could never have manufactured through spectacle alone. She has become trusted, not because a document said so overnight, but because, for more than 50 years, she showed up, and she never stopped. If this changed how you see the story you'd heard, that's worth sitting with for a moment. The truth, in this case, didn't need embellishment. It only needed to be told properly.